Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about asset-based risk assessments, and something that, so that you folks know my background. I've been with Compass now for, it'll be coming up 11 years in June. And prior to that, I worked 15 years at a credit union called St. Mary's Credit Union in Marlborough, Massachusetts in the IT department. So that's kind of where anybody who's worked in credit unions or banks know audit and risk assessments quite a bit, and suffer. Many of us suffer from audit fatigue because they never seem to end. But one of the things that we've been seeing, and I'll flip over to the first slide. One of the things that we've been seeing lately is something that I think has happened coming fully out of COVID. Before COVID, what I refer to as the before times, there was a little bit more focus on some of the risk assessments that go on, and risk assessments in the banking world, and really in the real all over the place, are a little bit different than audits. And one of the reasons that we go through those is kind of to see where our risks are, things that we want to take a look at. And I think in recent years, especially with COVID, when everybody kind of pulled back from doing on-sites and some of the depth in some of the audits that went on in the assessments, what we've started to find is that people have started doing risk assessments more as a check the box, something that they had to do to be compliant with other areas, rather than use those risk assessments to kind of determine what they need to do, what they need to fix, do they need to mitigate anything. And I've noticed in the past couple of years, the regulatory agencies in banking, FDIC, NCUA, especially NCUA, surprisingly enough, they've really done a very hard push for making sure that organizations have asset-based risk assessments in place. What I find across the board is many people do have risk assessments, but especially in the IT area, sometimes they have general IT control assessments and things like that. We'll get into a little bit about this. Asset-based risk assessment isn't significantly different, but it's a different kind of mindset, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit. First slide is just very, very basic. Asset-based risk assessment is exactly as it sounds, is you're doing a risk assessment, but it's based on the assets of your organization rather than anything else you might have to focus on. And in theory, it's supposed to help the organization figure out where they need to put their dollars and efforts for mitigating security issues. NIST, and I believe it's 800-30, I think I have it later in the presentation, actually has a guideline specifically for using a risk management approach, and has some great examples of going through. Unfortunately, a lot of the top half of NIST kind of tends to read like stereo instructions sometimes. So it's worth reading, but you kind of have to get through some of it. And it can be it's very formal language kind of going through. So one of the things that we found, one of the things I do at Compass an awful lot is we take on a lot of NIST cybersecurity framework assessments, ISO 27001, CIS controls, HIPAA, PCI, and a lot of people consider these risk assessments. And they're not really risk assessments. I mean, what they really do is they're what I consider control assessments, because really what happens is you have, NIST cybersecurity to use as an example, and I think PCI is a really great example too, is you have a set of controls that you have to adhere to for compliance. If you meet these controls, if you can answer yes to having all these things in place, you are PCI compliant. You are NIST cybersecurity framework compliant. I know there are tiers and maturity levels and everything else like that, but just giving as examples. You're meeting the ISO controls. So we do an awful lot of control-based risk assessments, and they're very useful. But what they also are is they're also very standard. And so you have the same list of controls that are for any organization. And where you kind of see gaps really, really clearly is something like PCI. And the reason I use that is PCI has 250 odd controls in their matrix of things you have to look at. And PCI requires that everybody from the small mom and pop store all the way up to big, huge conglomerates have to go through PCI assessments. And they very quickly figured out that not one size fits all to all people. So they created, based on the situation, how you take cards, how you're processing and everything, you can do a reduction in scope. And that's kind of it's a good way to think about that, because you could almost say, hey, based on the assets you have, hey, I'm not processing cards through a network. I'm only processing them on a line, and I have a third-party service provider who's doing all that. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means my network isn't a risk because I don't use the network. I have no network. That's not one of my assets. I have no people who access cardholder data at all. So that's not a risk. That particular asset isn't a risk. So PCI has worked hard to be able to determine that, their standard control assessment may not fit for everybody. And I use that as an example to show that while the control stuff is very, very important, and you want to be able to adhere to certain things, sometimes one of the things I like about the asset-based is the asset-based shows what the risks are for your organization, rather than the control assessments, which shows what controls are good security controls for any organization. So that's kind of where this slide goes, is, one is focusing on what you have versus compliance. One is, risk versus control. Because if you notice the control frameworks, if you look at the NIST control framework or the CIS, they don't really get into what the risk is. They say, are you doing this? Do you have this control in place? And you could say yes, but there might not be a risk to whatever control this is for your organization or not. So it really is control driven, where if you do an asset-based risk assessment, you're focusing on the risks to your assets. So everything you have should have some sort of applicability specifically to your organization. And then, like I said, standardization is the control set. Customization is in your environment for the risk-based asset. So one of the things that I get a lot of questions for, even in the banking world, is when somebody recommends, or a regulator recommends, doing an asset-based risk assessment. They say, well, what kind of assets? And probably I want to say around 2016, there was a huge credit union in Florida, and we came down to do a general IT controls audit for them. And we always take a look and we say, okay, what were your prior audit findings? And the regulators had come in and told them that they needed asset-based risk assessment. I said, okay, that's reasonable. And they said, well, it was a little more than that. And I said, what do you mean? Well, they wanted every single asset to have its own risk assessment. And I said, well, what do you mean? Well, we have 350 PCs. I said, okay. And they said, each one of them should be risk assessed separately. And I said, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. In theory, if you have the time and effort to go do that, that's fine. But that's not what I think of when that's not what I think of when I think of an asset-based risk assessment. So let's take a little step back. There are different types of assets. Obviously, the easiest is physical. Servers, laptops, endpoints, buildings, infrastructure. Those are all physical assets that you can come up with relatively quickly, either by doing an asset scan or, in the case of buildings or anything else like that, walking around the building. But assets are more than that. You have, your data is an asset. Especially if you're, think of that, your core system. You can have, or if you're doing software as a service and you have all this client data, that's an asset. If that get compromised or stolen or broken, there's a huge effect on you. So data is as much of an asset as a laptop is. Software can be an asset. You have a cloud service, that can be an asset. Your employees, if you have one IT guy that knows everything about, or a developer. That's it. Even, if you have somebody who developed your system for you, and they are a single point of failure and something happens to them, that's a critical asset that you may or may not be able to replace if something goes on. So when you're looking at assets, you want to take all of those things into account when you're taking a look at risk, because you're looking at organizational risks. So it really won't be my laptop is stolen necessarily. That certainly is a risk, and bad things could happen. But the pandemic can, if I lose half my staff, what's the risk to the organization? So because you've lost half of your employees, half of those assets in there. Once you've determined what the assets are, you want to rank them as how critical and non-critical are these assets. And these are those of you who work in different areas will see some of these lining up with things like business resiliency. And we'll talk a little, there's one slide I think that mentions that in a couple of places. But this is very, very similar to business impact analysis, is figuring out what you have, what are your assets, what are your key things in there, and then what's the criticality of them. So, and I always say, hey, I'm going to protect the database that's in my organization that has all my customer data. That's a lot more important to me than, my landscaping outside. Although beautiful, if someone lights my tree on fire that's outside my organization and it burns to the ground, hopefully not a lot of effect on my organization or my data or my customers. So having that criticality set up will allow you to say, okay, these are my most critical assets. These are the things I have to protect the most. These are the things I want to take a look at and prioritize, not only figuring out what the risks are, but do I have the right controls in place to be able to mitigate those risks? So if we look at asset-based risk assessment, what do we start with? Well, hopefully we start with the assets. And we just talked about a little bit about what they are and what needs protecting in there. And we're going to talk a little bit about inherent risk and controls and residual risk. And this is a slide that mentions NIST 800-30, which is Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments. Those of you who have used spreadsheets will, probably recognize some of the threats and impacts and vulnerabilities that go along. There are many software programs out there that will help you do risk assessments for you. Depending on the size and scope of the organization, a spreadsheet might be fine for what you need. Once you get into a certain level of assets and a certain level of risk and threats and things like that, you're going to find it very, very hard to continue to use spreadsheets to be able to do this. And you'll probably want to grab a system that can help you go through this, especially because a lot of the risks are the same. But there are several things once you've determined what your assets are. And hopefully most people on this call will know what a vulnerability is. Simply, it's a weakness that can be exploited by a threat. And flip that around, in the threat, what could exploit these vulnerabilities? And we'll give you a couple of examples of that as we go through this process. One thing that I do want to say is very, very important is what's the impact of this, of the threat, of the risk, and knowing what the consequences is if this event actually takes place, or if this attack takes place, is going to allow you to rate those risks. Normally this doesn't change no matter what controls you have. As an example, if we take a look at ransomware, and ransomware is going to have a significant or high impact if you have 0 controls, and if you have 150 controls, the impact is going to be the same if the attack lands and takes place. What changes is the likelihood of the event actually taking place. An inherent risk could be very, very high because you're not assessing with any controls. After you put the controls in, hopefully it's medium or lower of the event taking place because you have enough good controls. The impact stays the same, but the likelihood changes. So in that case, and again, the guidelines on NIST 830 has a lot of good stuff and a lot of good things in there to be able to use to kind of read through, and they give a lot of good examples as well to be able to pull from and go through that. The last point on this slide: risk assessment should be ongoing and adaptive, and I think I talk about that in the final slide too. Is for many people, risk assessments again have become a compliance exercise, which means they do it once a year. They look at the risk assessment. Yep, everything looks good. We're good to go, and everything else like that. If you're doing risk assessments as they were meant to be done, if you bring on new assets, they should be included in that risk assessment, and they shouldn't wait a year to be included in that risk assessment. If you completely change up, or you provide a new service, or you bring on a new you merge with another company, there's all sorts of new risks, new assets, new threats that have to be set up and understood as part of that. So if you're doing these properly, you're probably looking at them on not a daily basis or anything else like that, but you should have touchstones to make sure that these are all in place. The other good positive about doing this more than annually is the people that do it annually, it's usually a very, very heavy lift if they look at it once a year. If they look at it once a quarter, they can usually do minor tweaks to make sure these things are in place. So making sure that it's a little bit more ongoing than an annual basis can be very, very helpful to the organization itself.
I have a couple questions for you, Derek. Two
Perfect.
questions for you and one for me. The first question: this is being recorded. It will be uploaded to youtube.com/CompassIT Compliance, all one word, within the coming days after the presentation. First question for you, Derek: would insurance lower impact after controls applied?
So actually, insurance, I consider insurance a control. Cybersecurity insurance, as an example, it's not a preventative control because it won't stop things from happening, but it's absolutely, you can call it an administrative control or anything else like that. Where you have somebody coming in and being able to do forensics or provide advice or anything else like that. Cybersecurity is something you're paying for to make you whole again and coming forward. So it doesn't lower inherent risk at all, because inherent risk is by definition without any controls. But if you have cybersecurity in place, let's say ransomware, because that's the perfect example. If you have something set up where cybersecurity insurance is going to help make you whole and go forward, you could use it against residual risk and say, okay, again, the threat, that's one of the few that you could say it might lower the impact of the event happening. So there aren't a lot of controls that do that, but cybersecurity insurance would be one of them.
Another one for you, and before I ask this, I just want to remind everybody, feel free to pepper Derek with questions in the chat. We'll give him a chance to drink some water every now and then, but feel free to ask those kind of no matter what slide we're on, and I will ask those as they come in. This one came in directly to me, but it says, every department thinks their assets are the most important. IT cares about data, facilities worry about physical security, finance is focused on fraud risks. How do you get everyone on the same page when prioritizing risks without it turning into a turf war?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's not there's not an easy answer, but like most things, there's a couple of things that you want when you take a look at enterprise risk. You want to make sure that it's being championed by the top down. And so that's the first thing is the turf wars start because you start arguing back and forth laterally. And so the first thing you want is people coming in and going through that. The second thing is, quite honestly, when you do an asset-based risk assessment, there's going to be subjectivity in it most of the time. And we'll talk about qualitative versus quantitative a little bit in a future slide. But if you're doing a qualitative risk assessment, basically you're probably, depending on what your department is, you're probably the subject matter expert where it comes to this, and can do that. The other side of it is the great thing about an asset-based risk assessment is you guys get to come up with the risks. And so it can be, it definitely can be done. I usually do bounce it off a couple of people and say, hey, this is my interpretation of this risk. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why do you do that? And it's, yes, in some cases, dollars are going to be around. Data could be the most important. Physical assets could be. But at the end of the day, you're going to want, I'll call it C-level suite or whatever to sign off. This is where transparency comes in. If you look at the banking world, what usually happens is the individual departments start with these processes, rolls up to usually, audit. There's usually audit committee or risk committee or anything else like that will go through and kind of approve and stuff like that before it gets up to the C-level or the board. And they have a couple of different ways where they sign off on it and ask questions. And you could start with, a lot of high stuff that comes in, but it will help you prioritize because you can take a look at these risks and say, okay, even though every single person rated all their risks as high stuff, we can take a look and say, well, remediating these 20 take no money because it's going to be policy remediation or process doc or anything else like that. We can work on those tomorrow. There's a couple that we're going to have to buy brand new systems. That's going to be $100,000. We've got to scope that out and go through that. So some of that comes into the remediation process and understanding where it is. But the easiest thing to, there are times you're not going to be able to avoid the turf war. But really what you want to do is, again, for my big thing is I believe in transparency. So if we look at the risk assessment, these shouldn't be hidden or gone through. It should basically be kind of, usually you have a team working on some of these.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Derek.
And so, and now we're at the slide that says inherent risk. And I've seen it calculated two different ways. And really the first way coming out of NIST is standard, but I see the second method done a lot, especially if you're using a software program or risks have been provided for you already. So the first way is, threat times vulnerability, which is basically the risk itself, and then multiplied by impact. So an example is, a web application with, weak authentication, which is a high vulnerability, and then facing cyber threats, you could, which is a high threat level, could lead to a data breach, which is there's the risk. And a data breach would be considered a high impact, making the inherent risk high. Now, the thing to remember on inherent risk is there are no controls behind it yet. And so that's the thing that trips a lot of people up is I come in and I look at inherent risk and 2/3 of the inherent risk is low. And I said, well, why is this low? And they said, well, this couldn't happen because we have all, I said, nope. I said, the minute you say, because we have all these things in place, that's not inherent risk anymore. That's residual risk after the control is. So normally, if I'm performing these, an asset-based risk assessment, the inherent risk, people their eyes kind of pop because I usually rank a lot of them high because I think to myself, if there are really no controls in place, if I'm not doing vulnerability scans, if I'm not patching things, if I don't have good access controls in place, what's the likelihood that this is going to happen? It's going to be pretty high. And that's where we get to calculate the calculation method 2 is how likely is this event to occur? Well, with no controls in place, it's usually pretty likely, not for everything, but for a lot of stuff. Especially if you're taking a look at cyber threats and things like that, if you don't have, good firewalls or good monitoring or anything in place, sooner or later you're getting hit with this. So the likelihood is pretty high. Impact is going to be, depending what's being hit. Is it our data? Is it our endpoints? Is it our personnel? That's going to help you determine the impact going forward from that sort of thing. Where are these little things? There they are. Okay. So we talked a little bit about controls, and there are 3 major areas of controls. Once you have the inherent risk, what you want to do after you've rated the inherent risk, and again, you could use the traffic light system, depending on the size and scope of inherent risk. You can do high, medium, and low. Especially if you're starting out, that's an easy way. I see a lot of people doing 5-level. So low, medium, high, high, things like that. I've seen some people go out of their minds and do, levels of 10. It gets, you can get really, really granular, but I also find diminishing returns on how useful that can be. So especially if you're a smaller organization, or this is your first time out, or you haven't done a lot of these, usually I've settled around the 5 levels for what's the likelihood, and then what's the threat, what's the severity, excuse me. And you use those basically to determine what the inherent risk is. So once you have inherent risk set up, then we talk about what kind of controls are out there. The easiest ones are administrative. Policy, procedure, security awareness training. These are all controls. And if you're not listing them as part of the arrows in your quiver, then you're kind of missing out, because people will come in and say, well, we don't have any good controls around those. Well, do you have a security policy? Do you have security awareness training to combat some of this stuff, especially security? If your threat is a phishing or a ransomware or anything else like that, I would expect to see security awareness training as one of your controls. The most common ones that everybody looks at, especially in cybersecurity, are technical controls. Firewalls, encryption, multi-factor. Access controls are technical controls. Anything else like that. So those are going to be the bulk. If you're talking about cybersecurity items that are there, are going to be technical controls. Hopefully they combine with the administrative controls to provide kind of a robust area, and it will flow from administrative right into technical. Physical controls, and I'm seeing a lot more focus around physical controls lately. And I think this is part of the reason coming out of COVID too, is once COVID happened, so many buildings became, ghost towns, that they weren't kind of concentrating on physical controls when they were doing risk assessments or audits. And again, in the last year or two, I've seen a much bigger push for reviews of physical controls, not only because people are trying to get people to come back to the office, but they also figured out that offices are only half staffed or half empty are much easier to use social engineering tactics and other tactics to get into. So physical controls are, they're relatively simple. Security cameras, key card access, locked doors, anything else like that will keep people out of areas that they shouldn't have access to. So once we've looked at inherent risk, and once we've assigned controls, we look at residual risk. So residual risk is the risk of the threat after we've put the controls in place. And usually you look at how effective your controls are. So as an example, if you're doing patching, and you have a patch policy and everything else like that, but you're not actually patching the machines, and nothing is going on, and we come in and take a look at that, well, the effectiveness of controls aren't very effective. And we're going to note it, and we're going to say, hey, you got to get your patching under control here. On the other hand, if you come in and say, we're completely up to date on our patches, Bob patches everything for us, and we are completely there. I said, that's terrific. I said, do you have a policy that shows, how often you patch? Or, nope, we just give it all to Bob. I said, well, that's great. What if Bob goes somewhere? Do you know exactly what Bob does and how he does it? Well, no. I said, okay. So in the first example, you have a good administrative control and a very, very poor technical control. And I would consider that probably didn't lower the risk that much. On the flip side, you have a very, very good set of technical controls. All the patching is taking place, close the holes, everything looks good. But were something to happen, you don't have somebody who can pick up the slack because they don't know exactly what Bob does. So I could consider that less risky, but certainly something that still needs to be addressed. So that's kind of how you, and again, the goal is to reduce residual risk to an acceptable level. Now, that's kind of important because what's acceptable for one organization may not be acceptable for another. And this is why when we take a look at asset-based risk, one of the key pluses to doing it that way is that it's your organization you're looking at versus how everybody else is doing something. Because something that's inherently risky for one organization might not be. If you have something that, if you have systems where there's nothing in place, you've got a couple of switches and maybe a firewall, and people come and go and connect and go in, patching might not be the same, have the same issues as if you've got an organization with 300 workstations and they're never being patched, or and using this example, obviously, misconfigurations in firewalls and things like that, and how do you have that sort of stuff set up?
Two more questions for you, Derek.
Yep.
IT department has no revenue, but cyber risk is high. How do you justify for IT department?
IT department is always going to be a loss leader. There's nothing, because IT. So again, and I apologize for those of you who don't work in banking, but we were always jealous of the lending department because the lending department was always held up to us. The lending department makes us money. You guys cost us money, and that's not the right way to think about it. Is if done properly, the IT department and IT should include, security in here to be able to reduce risk. It's very important. Is you're looking to prevent security events and incidents and all sorts of things like that, who are going to cost money to the organization, but also reputational risk and things of that nature. And it's the IT department who is usually the first line of defense in those. So if the IT department doesn't have the proper tools or doesn't have a risk assessment that shows them, hey, we're risky in all these areas that IT is responsible for, to lower this risk means that the enterprise is more secure and you're less likely to get hit by ransomware or phishing or anything else like that. Those are going to be key components in keeping your organization safe. Again, you've got to make sure that the people at the C-level suite understand this, because you're always going to say, well, this is going to cost us money. But at the end of the day, I can also say that, the non-IT departments, is going to be very hard for them to do their job if IT isn't on the ball. So it works together. But yeah, the people in the IT department, and when I was there and I was doing budgets and everything and always had to justify where I was going and how much money I was spending and why, use your security department and if you have third parties coming in and doing audits or doing risk assessments with you and everything else like that, leverage them. And so when you go for the budget and you go for the ask, you can say, listen, this is set up as a, our auditors found this as a high risk, regulators, whoever we want to call. And if we do this lowers our risk and there's less of a chance to this happening. Now, unfortunately, you could still get a CEO or people that says, hey, we accept that risk. We're not going to pay this money to fix this or do that or anything else like that. And that's happened a couple of times. And I've said, okay, put that down in writing so I have it. So if something does happen, you're not coming and say, why did this break? But you want to avoid that kind of confrontation. You really want to work with the C-levels and show why this is important. What's the other question, Nick?
Next question is, when and how are physical controls of the home office addressed?
Are the home office addressed? So I have a couple of answers to that, depending on, I probably need a little bit of extra context, but the physical controls, like I said, if you take a look at an asset-based risk assessment, physical buildings and areas that you get into and everything, that's those should be part of your risk assessment. And say, okay, and I'll, as an example, I'll say IT server room. And I actually had a client that was talking about that, and facilities was fighting with IT because IT wanted badge access to the server room, and facilities didn't see the need. They said, the door is locked. And I said, okay, well, how do we know who goes in and who goes out? Well, we have the keys. I said, who has the keys? Well, IT has the keys, facility has the keys, everything else like that. And I said, well, if somebody takes the IT key, could they get in? Well, that wouldn't happen. Well, what if it does happen? I said, can you track it? Do you know they're going in? Well, no. I said, is there a camera in front of the door? I said, well, no. And so when you think risk assessments, what could happen? And again, let's take a step back. The asset is the server room. And, physical access to the server room provides, what's the threat? Well, we can tamper with servers. We can steal equipment. More importantly is being able to, access and things like that. You could put in USBs with ransomware, do all sorts of crazy stuff. And so the risk, the likelihood with no controls, or the likelihood with just a locked door even, because if that's the only control, the inherent risk is going to be high. And then you look at the control, and the only control we have is a door lock. We'd have no cameras, no way to trace who went in and who went out, or anything else like that. Then I would consider those controls weak controls. And so I leave the residual risk as high as well. And I said, okay, with a high residual risk, we have to make everybody comfortable with what the risk is. So what do we do? Well, I refused. Badge access costs too much money. I said, okay, let's put in a camera. So at least you can see who goes in and who goes out at all times. And we have a logbook, and we put in a policy that requires anybody that goes into the server room has to sign the logbook and date it and do everything else like that. Not my first choice, but it lowers the risk enough that everybody's happy enough with the solution. So that's an example of and you put in the physical, obviously physical controls are key to anybody. If your whole environment is cloud, you have next to zero physical controls. If you have on-prem, then physical controls are usually some of the easiest to take care of, quite honestly.
I want to thank everybody for the questions. I have actually two more. One's for me and one's for you, Derek. And, keep them coming. We love this. The first one's for me. Will the slides of this webinar be shared? Yes, we share out the slides with whatever ISACA body you're registered with. So they will be the ones to distribute the slides to you afterwards. Question for you, Derek. When performing an asset-based assessment, such as an IT hardware risk assessment, what would you suggest as appropriate categories to consolidate the asset types?
Yep. So I have about 10, and that's a great question. Like I said in my earlier example, the whatever regulator wanted 300 risk assessments for 300 desktops was out of his tree, in my opinion. So I usually have between 10 and a dozen categories that I use for IT physical assets: laptops, desktops, servers. I do break off Active Directory if it's on-prem as a separate category, just because the risks to that, to me, are different. The easiest way to think of it is if you can categorize stuff where normally 95% of my desktops, if not 100, are going to pretty much have the same risks going across. Same thing for the laptops. Printers is going to be one. I use firewalls. Sometimes switches and routers are in the same group. Sometimes they're broken out. But basically, you want to put, where the way I group them is if I have a risk, then they should apply to the asset group in question. And if there's enough difference between them, like I said, an Active Directory server or an Exchange server, which thank God there aren't too many of those on-prem anymore. But if you look at those, even though they're servers, I don't put them in the server bucket because the risks are different enough, or there are more risks in those servers than having, than just say a file server. So you may decide your database, if you're heavy into database servers, you may break out your database servers and then put all file servers under one being the type of server. Or if you're web facing a lot and you have a lot of web servers and things like that, you may put those in their own category. But you should still be able to group. But if you have 25 web servers, you're going to find that the risks are going to be similar if they're externally facing across the board. So you should be able to group those together. Printers, I group together, and things of that nature. So normally I come up with, 10 to 15 of, asset groups in the physical stuff. You could break them out further if you want to see, and if things aren't working, but normally that's where we go. And I'll even say on top of that, my desktop group and my laptop group, about 50% of the 50% of the risks are the same in both groups. So I do a decent amount of cutting and pasting where that sort of stuff goes, like encryption, access control, things that, if I take a look, the controls are the same. The risks can be, hey, phishing can be one, obviously ransomware. If I look at those and risks, those apply to more than one category. So once you've identified the asset groups, you'll find as you start building them, you're like, oh, this is an asset, this is a risk across 4 or 5 of these different groups. So don't be afraid if you see duplicates. That's fine. We run into that all the time.
Thank you so much, Derek.
All right, next slide, how to perform. And we kind of talked about that. First thing to do, identify your assets. Inventory, and identifying them includes ranking them. How important are these assets to you, and what's the criticality? You may find that you have so many assets that you're going to take, and quite honestly, the way we did it for a group recently is we took the hardware first because it was low-hanging fruit. We could identify what the hardware was fairly easily before we got into applications. This one particular place had about 30 different applications that they used. And so the data and the applications, they wanted to risk the use of that as well. So don't think you have to do everything on the first pass. Figure out what you can do easily. And then step 2, obviously taking a look at what are the threats and vulnerabilities. And you can include natural disasters, things like that. We take a look at risk, impact, and likelihood. Again, this is a slide I will always get backwards. I do have a cheat sheet on here. Usually it's on my laptop, but because I'm in the hotel room, I wrote it down. Qualitative versus quantitative. Qualitative, and I hope I got this right. Qualitative is kind of, you're the subject matter expert. You're saying, hey, based on this, this is what I think the impact is, and this is what I think the likelihood is. Where if you have quantitative, you actually have data from other source. You could have data from your own source. Over the last 5 years, here's how many times a DDoS attack came in. So we consider the likelihood low, or we consider it super high. Most people who are starting out use qualitative. Quantitative, I've heard the arguments back and forth between them. Quantitative, obviously, you're using real world data and everything. It is more, to me, it's more difficult to use that. But sometimes you'll get less pushback, as the question was earlier in the presentation. How do you keep from fighting with each other if I think it's high and you think it's low? Well, that case, you're using qualitative. One way that you could stop the fights is if there's actually data, like the Verizon data breach report that comes out every year, and you can show, hey, phishing is 95% in our type of organizations got hit by phishing things last year. I consider this high. And you can show the data, and there's no, it's probably, I won't say it's irrefutable, but there's probably a lot less grumbling. But what I see out there, I'm going to say it's probably an 80-20 split with qualitative, where it's your organization, so you guys consider yourselves kind of the experts, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as you can, kind of back it up a little bit. And then obviously the last step, risk prioritization and mitigation. Once you have the residual risk, what's your action plan? If your residual risk is still high, do you just accept it? You say, hey, if we put these two controls in, we can get it down to low. Who do we assign it to? What's the time frame involved? Basically, a little project plan comes out of that. That comes, and then hopefully the next time you look at the risk, you've added those controls and the risk is lower. Why it matters? Well, the good news is we've talked about most of that. Risk assessments is, believe it or not, it is proactive security. If you can identify where the risks are and help close the holes, then it's not a, oh my God, we got hit. What do we have to do to fix this? It's, hey, if where we are today, we could get hit, we're vulnerable in these areas. That's what we're looking to. And even though I talked earlier about, control assessments, the regulatory compliance, if you look at NIST and you look at HIPAA and you look at things, they're all saying, have you done a risk assessment? And it's different from a control assessment. They want, as part of being compliant with NIST, as part of being compliant with HIPAA, and although PCI is kind of screwed with the risk assessment format a little bit and done targeted risk assessments, they still want to see that you're, taking a look at your organization and seeing where your risk points are. I talked earlier, business continuity and incident response. They use these, the risk assessments, figure out what your, where your crown jewels and how are you protecting them. If I'm doing business continuity, for example, and I have a risk assessment and I say this database, without this database, we're out of business. I'm going to put the most controls around the database. If I say, without this developer, we're out of business, then, I got to start looking at, well, what's the backup if they're not around and being able to do that. So this is a big help in business continuity and incident response, because incident response, you can say, oh, we have all these controls in place, but it's still a high risk in going, so obviously we're talking about asset-based risk assessment. Threat-based risk assessment, basically think about, if you run a vulnerability scan, this is the easiest way to look at it, and you get 4,000 vulnerabilities that come out. I have this happened recently at an organization, and as it turns out of those 4,000, 3,000 of them were because every single phone handset had 8 vulnerabilities on it. So when you look at it, the risks on those were relatively low. And we were able to put, looking at that sort of stuff, because the threat to them, you had to get into that. It was actually a hardware issue. You had to be in the network. You had to be on the right network because they had already segmented the phones out. So it was even though they came up as medium and a couple of high vulnerabilities, the threat was relatively low once it came out, even though there were a lot of them. So you can do vulnerability and pen tests to show what the threat-based risks are on there. And vulnerability based, obviously, for that sort of stuff. And then the reverse, which isn't listed here, if you're doing a control assessment, when we're doing control assessments, if you're not meeting the control, I actually kind of say, okay, if you don't meet this control, here's what your risk is, and here's how you remediate it. So it's kind of I don't want to say backwards, but it's a different way of saying, I'm trying to meet the control for compliance. What's the risk if I don't meet this control? And so there are different ways to do it. But if you take the assets, like I said before, the big thing about the assets are they're specific to your organization.
Another question for you, Derek.
Yes,
sir. How can you get a company to see the value in a comprehensive asset-based risk assessment, administrative, technology, and physical to all types of assets, instead of only performing a technology-focused risk assessment?
Well, so if you look at a technology-based risk assessment, you have, usually that's, network and physical and things like that. The key is in a lot of cases, as an example, think about backups. And again, in my example where data isn't an IT, it shouldn't be owned by IT. It can be protected by IT, can even be managed in a database. But the data is more often, to me, it's a business owner who owns the data, who manages the data, who prioritizes the data. Is it confidential data? Is it regulatory restricted data? Is it marketing data, which means anybody can look at it? It's a public data. So taking a look at that, if you're doing a risk assessment, even things that most people think are IT isn't really a technology risk assessment as much as it is. If you think assets, you go out of that and for an example, banks and credit unions, which drive me crazy, the regulators come in and always lump online banking in with the IT assessments. 20 years ago, IT was hip deep in online banking. Now I talk to IT departments about online banking. They're like, no, operations does all that. They handle all that other stuff. And using, a perfect example is usually IT doesn't get involved with wire transfers at banks. But if a wire transfer goes sideways, you lose all that money. And because it works like cash. If you get a fraudulent wire transfer out of a financial institution, there's a lot of money that's lost in there. That is not an IT issue. Now, there might be IT controls that need to secure that, but it's not the IT department's job usually to run wire transfers or anything else like that. So you can have some IT controls, but a lot of these, and that's one of the reasons that asset-based is so important, is because it includes everything in addition to IT. If you limit it to IT, then you can have a very strong IT department. But remember too, people are an asset. So without those in place, if you're not taking a look at, where the gaps are or what's the most important data or what's the most important process that you have out there, in a lot of cases, it would be, hey, if we lose this third party that we're dealing with, that IT has nothing to do with, we're out of luck. And so that's the riskiest thing that's out there. So that's kind of what you want to look at.
Thank you, Derek.
All right, we're running up. Let's see, asset-based risk in practice. So obviously, integrates. We already talked about the security frameworks ad nauseum. How you use these, again, prioritizing cybersecurity investments. If you have a risk assessment, you can see not only what needs to be fixed, but hopefully how important these assets are. So if you have 100 things you need to remediate, it'll allow you to structure, hey, what's the most important? What gives us our biggest bang for the buck? In some cases, putting in one system or one process fixes like 8 of these things. Oh, well, we're going to do that first because it gives us the biggest bang for the buck. It does identify gaps in your controls. Hey, we're missing this. We got to put this in. And, plus, if you give it up to the C-level or risk management committee or board or whoever you want to do, you can show them, hey, here's our riskiest stuff we have. Here's what we're doing to combat it. But it would be even better if we did this. And it allows senior management to kind of see. Now, one of the things I didn't talk about in some of this stuff is when you do business impact analysis, a lot of times they say, what's the impact? If you do a quantitative impact, you can say, well, if ransomware happens, it's going to cost us $5 million versus this is going to be really, really bad. So if you can put a dollar amount, if you can do that quantitatively, then you can, it even gives you a bigger bang if you're going to a board and saying, if this happens, this is what it's going to cost us as a company. A couple of quick things, and we've gone, asset threat, vulnerability, impact, or risk. Customer database is an example. We talked about that. If there's a cyber attack, the vulnerability could be weak access controls. The impact or risk could be data breach, regulatory fines. These are 2 quick and dirty little, risk assessment based on assets. The asset could be a customer database. The asset could be an office building. In the office building one, the threats, obviously, unauthorized access. The vulnerability could be we have no cameras, we have no door locks. And the impact is, hey, you could steal stuff. Employees could get, hurt going forward. In the first one, the asset is the customer database. So these are both assets. And if you were working up this risk assessment, this is just a risk that goes along with some of the assets that go on. And then taking a look at the next slide is you can say, okay, for the customer database, here are the controls. So both of these in the last slide, I can say, okay, inherent risk is going to be high with no controls in place for both of these. For the first one, you can use access controls, audit and logging, SOC monitoring, backups and encryption, incident response plans, DLP systems, everything else like that. These are the controls. And say, okay, with all these controls in place, we consider the risk to be medium. We've gone from high to medium in this. Do we need to get it to low? Are we okay with medium? Those are discussions you can have based on what's on there. And then for the physical one, it's even easier. What do? We put in door locks, we put in alarms, we badge access the facility. We've got logbooks in, we've got cameras. Maybe we hire security guards. And we take what is a high risk getting into the building. And with all these in place, we say, okay, this is a low risk. The chances of somebody getting in now is low. And we've just done a risk assessment based on 2 assets. So final slide, key takeaways, the stuff in red, critical risks to assets. That's, key is what you're looking for. Reflects your organization. It's your risk assessment. It's not a control assessment that everybody uses. You can do that, and you should do that as well because it's best of breed. But in this case, if you get a risk assessment, it should be it reflects you. So I can say, oh, company A, hey, this is what you're doing. These are your risks. This is how, and it should be different from company B. And then obviously, yes, it's a point in time, but you don't want to just get back to it, every year, every other year, or anything else like that. You're probably making enough changes that you can do some updates backwards and forwards. The other key things, obviously, having a risk assessment framework. Usually you can pick a NIST or an ISO or anything else like that, but sometimes they don't all line up the way you want them to, so you customize it. It will support, any regulatory thing. Usually they ask if you have a risk assessment at this point. And then you use these assessments and say, hey, we're deficient in these areas. When we go for budget next year, we're going to look to remediate at least half of this stuff, so we're going to need that much money. I'm at 12:59 right now, so